People showed up to protest against Trump everywhere, not just in all 50 states, but in every state, multiple, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds of protests. Start in the great state of Alabama. At least 15 No Kings protests all around the state of Alabama. People protested at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. They protested in Oxford, Alabama. Hundreds of people turned out there. In Montgomery, they marched from Riverfront Park. Here's a look at the crowds that turned out in Huntsville, Alabama, and in Birmingham, where the march started at Railroad Park. Here's Dothan, Alabama, and Guntersville, Alabama. Head up to Alaska. At least 25 No Kings protests all across Alaska, including Nome and Homer and Juneau and Sitka, basically every town of any size that you can name in Alaska, and a bunch you've never heard of. Look at the big crowd in Anchorage. Right? We've got a big, look at the crowd in Anchorage. Here's also Seward and Fairbanks, and in Wasilla, from which Sarah Palin can see Russia from her house. Now to Arizona. More than 60 No Kings protests all across the state of Arizona. State's newsroom reports that when Arizona had its huge turnout for the No Kings protests in June, one of those states where people were really wowed by the turnout in June, that was about 40 Arizona protests in June. This time, they had 60, including Scottsdale and Goodyear, Arizona. Also Flagstaff, one of my favorite places in the whole country. People turned out all along Route 66 in Flagstaff. And look at the huge crowd. Look at Phoenix. Look at the huge crowd that turned out at the state capitol in Phoenix. On to Arkansas. No Kings organizers and Pride March organizers got lucky this weekend when both Arkansas's annual Pride Parade and the No Kings protests happened to fall on the same day, on Saturday. Everybody seemed pretty happy with the coincidence. Events kind of dovetailed in Little Rock. This woman from Conway, Arkansas, came out to Little Rock to show that she was proud of her 3 Antifa, that is anti-fascist uncles, who fought for this country and against fascism in World War II. But lots and lots of people turned out in Little Rock, Arkansas this weekend. Here's also a look at Jonesboro, Arkansas, and Vilonia, Arkansas. That's in Faulkner County, population less than 5,000. And here's Hot Springs, Arkansas, in the pouring rain. Tons of people turned out. Yeah, I could spend the whole night just showing you protests in California alone, but here's just a sampling from Livermore and Oakland, both in Northern California, and then Long Beach and Los Angeles in Southern California. Los Angeles had big protests over the course of the day, spread out over the course of the day. But so many of the California protests were just huge. I mean, Sacramento was really, really big. Look at Sacramento, upper left there. San Diego, upper right. Look how big that is. Look at Santa Cruz. San Francisco was always going to be big, but Trump's threat to send troops to San Francisco may have goosed the turnout there. It covered more than a dozen city blocks in San Francisco. Colorado, here's Denver, where an overflow crowd spilled out of Civic Center Park. And here's Colorado Springs, and here's Centennial, Colorado. Here's Littleton, Colorado. Connecticut, at least 50 different No Kings protests in Little Connecticut this weekend. 50 different events. Here's New Haven and Milford and Westport and Hartford. The state capitol was a huge turnout at the state capitol in Connecticut this weekend. On to Delaware. Here's Rehoboth Beach and Bethany Beach and Newark and Wilmington, North Carolina. They got a big crowd along the Bancroft Parkway in Wilmington. Florida never disappoints, depending on how you think about disappointment. Really big crowds in Miami in particular this weekend. Apparently some local Proud Boys came out to try to start stuff with the No Kings Proud in Miami, but people just shouted them down and nothing really happened. So here's a look at Miami. Again, big crowds in Miami, big crowds in Jacksonville. We saw good turnout in St. Augustine and in St. Petersburg and in Tampa. Just tons of people turned out in all sorts of different protests all across Florida. The Bulwark posted this video. This is of interest, particularly to political junkies. This is the Villages in Florida, which is the famous supposed Republican voting stronghold in Florida. Thousands of retirees turned out at the Villages this weekend to protest against Trump there. That's something. In Georgia, there was a huge No Kings protest in Atlanta. But that wasn't the only one. State's Newsroom is reporting that there were 40 different No Kings protests in Georgia this weekend, including these in Savannah and in Macon and in Augusta, in addition to that huge one in Atlanta that just covered multiple city blocks and seemed to go on forever. Hawaii, point of interest here, Hawaii did not call itself No Kings this weekend. Hawaii did not call their protest No Kings protest, since the Hawaiian people, quite rightfully, did have kings and also queens. So in Hawaii, in order to be sensitive on that issue, it was instead no dictators. And who can argue with that? They had a good turnout at their No Dictators protests on Maui and in Hilo and in Kona in the pouring rain. And a ton of people turned out in Honolulu. Idaho. Everybody thinks of Idaho as so hard right. It's like the poster child for a hard right-wing state. But tell that to the massive numbers of people who keep turning up for anti-Trump events like this No Kings protest this weekend in Boise. The Idaho Statesman said they talked to a number of people who said this might be the largest protest anyone has ever seen in Boise for anything. So here's a look at Boise and also Pocatello and McCall, Idaho, and Nampa, Idaho. In Illinois, I think we knew it was going to be big in Chicago. Did we know the Chicago protest would stretch to fill 22 city blocks? I'm not sure we knew it was going to be that big. I'm not sure anybody could have expected that. But yeah, Chicago there in the upper right-hand side. Here's also Carbondale, Illinois. Here's Little Park Ridge, Illinois. Here's Urbana, Illinois. On to Indiana. Indianapolis was really, really big. Here's also Columbus, Indiana, and South Bend, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. In Iowa, Des Moines was huge. Look at Davenport, was really big. Look at Cedar Rapids, was really big. Here's Des Moines again, along with Dubuque, Iowa, and Decorah, Iowa, and Iowa City. Just big turnout all over Iowa this weekend. Kansas, here's Topeka, Kansas. And that's in the upper right. You got Overland Park in the upper left, Wichita, Kansas in the lower left. Hello, Frog Hat. Lawrence, Kansas in the lower right. Kentucky. In Lexington, it was a mile-long march route up Main Street and down Vine Street, and the whole No Kings crowd filled that whole mile-plus route, plus Courthouse Plaza in Lexington. Just huge turnout in Lexington. Here's a look at that crowd in Lexington and also the crowd in Paducah and Owensboro, Kentucky. And of course, Louisville, which saw a bunch of people turn out in Louisville, Kentucky this weekend. Louisiana had at least 11 different No Kings protests all over the state. Here's New Orleans and Baton Rouge and Lafayette and Shreveport. Up to Maine. This was the 250th anniversary of the British attack on Portland, Maine. Thousands of people turned out at more than 30 protests in Maine. In Portland, they say they had a really, really big turnout at the June No Kings event. But this time they say they think they may have doubled the numbers that they had turn out in June. Look at that. Here's Portland and Bangor and Augusta, the state capital. Also Southwest Harbor on Mount Desert Island in Maine. Maryland. Here's a look at Baltimore and also Townsend, Maryland, and Frederick, Maryland. Local press in Maryland reported on surprisingly large No Kings events, even in the really Republican parts of the state, like out on the Eastern Shore. Okay, Massachusetts. Yeah, Boston, come on. Look at that. Again, not AI. That's a real thing. Look at that crowd in Boston. Boston Mayor Michelle Wu told the huge crowd at the Boston Common that in Boston, every day is No Kings Day. Because duh. It was just huge in Boston, but there were more than 100 No Kings protests in little old Massachusetts, including one in Western Massachusetts in Northampton, which shut down the whole downtown. They had to close all of Main Street in downtown Northampton. Here's a look at Boston alongside Concord and Haverhill, Massachusetts, that long stretch of people there. Also Maynard, Massachusetts, but again, more than 100 No Kings events in Massachusetts. Michigan also had more than 100 No Kings protests this weekend all over the state, including up into the Upper Peninsula. Here's a look at Ann Arbor up in the upper left, where they had a huge turnout. Also a really big turnout in Detroit. There's a look at Ferndale, Michigan in the lower left there, and of course our beloved Flint, Michigan in the lower right. Minnesota, did you see the aerial shots of Minneapolis this weekend? I mean, I don't know, head-to-head Minneapolis to Boston. This is pretty intense, right? I don't know why I was surprised to see something that huge for No Kings in Minneapolis, but Minneapolis was just gigantic. Here's Minneapolis and also Duluth in the upper left, Anoka, Minnesota, and Northfield, Minnesota. Head from Minnesota down to Mississippi. No Kings protests, not just in, college town Oxford, Mississippi, the home of Ole Miss, and in Jackson, where people rallied on the South Lawn of the Mississippi State Capitol. But you also saw good turnout and big protests in Hernando, Mississippi, and in spunky little beautiful Gulfport, Mississippi. They got a big crowd there. Missouri, Kansas City Star described the No Kings protests in Missouri as, quote, taking over Kansas City. The paper saying throngs of people filled and then spilled out of Mill Creek Park in Kansas City. So here's a look at Kansas City, Missouri. It really was big. And Columbia, Missouri, which was also really big. Springfield, Missouri. Look at that, both sides of the street. And then up in the upper right-hand corner there, that's Jefferson City, the state capital of Missouri. People there on the state capitol steps. Montana, 31 different No Kings events in Montana. Lots of people in Missoula turned out, but also surprising numbers in some surprising places. Here's West Yellowstone and Red Lodge, Montana. That's Bozeman up in the upper left. Our friends again at States Newsroom report that in Polebridge, Montana, which is right on the edge of Glacier National Park, they had more people turn out to protest than the actual population of the town. Welcome, visitors. Here's a hippo suit and a sign. Thank you for visiting. Nebraska, 15 different No Kings protests across the state. Hello, Omaha. Here's Lincoln, Nebraska in the upper right there. Look at that crowd. And Fremont, Nebraska, and Scottsbluff in the lower right there. Nevada, the Reno one was really, really big. Here's Carson City as well as Reno. Here's Henderson, Nevada. And of course, beautiful Las Vegas. There were dozens of No Kings protests in Live Free or Die, New Hampshire this weekend. NHPR, New Hampshire Public Radio, talked to people who said they had never seen a protest in Concord, New Hampshire that was as large as the one there this weekend at the State House and along Main Street in Concord. Here's a look at Littleton, New Hampshire, and Portsmouth. Here's Plymouth, New Hampshire, and New London. People turned out in Revolutionary War garb because, of course, it's New Hampshire. New Jersey had dozens of No Kings protests. Here's a look at some of the New Jersey No Kings protests. Montclair, New Jersey, up in the upper left. Newton, Morristown, the great city of Newark, New Jersey. Toms River on Red Bank, New Jersey. Hello. New Mexico, thousands and thousands of people. Absolutely. Look at that. Filled the streets of Albuquerque. Local Channel 7 reported that it brought Albuquerque traffic to a halt for so long and across so many streets that Albuquerque drivers stopped waiting for it to pass and just parked their cars and got out of their cars to either watch and wait or to themselves just join it. So that is the huge crowds in Albuquerque on the left side of your screen there. Also really big numbers turning out in places like Santa Fe and Las Cruces. Upstate New York had more than 20 different No Kings protests. But in New York City, it was just absolutely massive. The ACLU says that 20,000 people trained in advance of this protest. 20,000 people did some kind of training with the ACLU, nonviolence training, de-escalation training, know your rights training. That should have given us some sort of sign that the turnout in New York City was going to be this massive. Just unbelievable in New York. Here's also a look at Buffalo, New York, and Syracuse and Rochester as well. North Carolina, big protests in Raleigh, North Carolina this weekend. Here's also a look at Charlotte, North Carolina, and Waxhaw, and Morganton, and Durham, North Carolina, with that aerial shot there so you can see how it wraps around the downtown in Durham. Head up to North Dakota. Not only these big crowds in Fargo and Bismarck, but there were No Kings protests in Grand Forks and Jamestown and Devils Lake and Dickinson and Williston and Minot and a bunch of other places. Here's Fargo on your left and Bismarck on your right. We've also got shots from Valley City, North Dakota, upper right there, and Grand Forks in the lower right there, all those places in North Dakota. On to Ohio, our friend Professor Tim Snyder, the author of On Tyranny. He spoke at a No Kings event in Cincinnati, right there at the Riverfront Park. Thousands of people turned out at the Ohio State House in Columbus. Look at that. Really big turnout in Columbus, Ohio. But there were dozens of No Kings events in Ohio this weekend. Hello, Toledo. Hello, Dayton. Hello, Worcester, Ohio. And say it with me now. Hello, Cleveland. Oklahoma saw just huge crowds in Oklahoma City. Look at that. Look at that shot in Oklahoma City. But there were 19 different Oklahoma No Kings protests this weekend. Here's a look at Tulsa as well, the upper left. One of my favorite cities in the country, Durant, Oklahoma, Muskogee, Oklahoma. Lots of people turning out in Oklahoma in the rain. Up to Oregon. You think anybody turned out in Portland, Oregon? Thousands and thousands and thousands of people turned out in Portland, Oregon. Nobody was left at home in Portland this weekend. Everybody was out at a No Kings event. But Oregon did not only turn out in Portland, they turned out everywhere, from the state capitol in Salem to Eugene and Beaverton and Oregon City. There were more than 50 No Kings protests all across the great state of Oregon this weekend. Pennsylvania saw massive crowds in Philadelphia. Look at that aerial shot in Philly, upper left-hand side there. But here's also a look at Pittsburgh and Westchester and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Rhode Island, little old Rhode Island, it's famous for you. Here's Providence, where there were tens of thousands of people at the state capitol. Here's also Little Compton, Rhode Island, on the upper right there. East Greenwich and Westerly, Rhode Island, saw tons of people turn out. South Carolina, here's Columbia and Spartanburg and Greenville and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Up to South Dakota, thousands of people showed up in Sioux Falls, far outdrawing the numbers that organizers expected, according to reporting from the South Dakota Searchlight. Thousands of people turned out in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Now, in Sioux Falls, there was a planned counter demonstration, but as thousands of people turned out for the main No Kings thing, apparently only 30 people showed up for the whole counter demonstration, which was quite a disappointment for the counter demonstration organizers, who I guess thought they'd get like equal numbers. Sorry. Here's a look at Sioux Falls and Vermilion, South Dakota, and Aberdeen and Sturgis. Tennessee saw nearly 36 No Kings protests this weekend, including really big ones in Memphis, as you might expect, as Trump tries to send the military into Memphis as well. Also, really big turnout in Nashville. Look at that on the upper right. Here's also a look at Knoxville, which was big in the lower left-hand corner there, in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Texas also got big crowds at Fort Worth and in Frisco, Texas. Dallas, huge crowds in Dallas, huge crowds in Houston, one of the greatest cities in America. A good turnout in Laredo, right on the border. Over in Utah, Utah saw a really, really, really big crowd at this. Look at that, upper left-hand corner. Look at the crowd in Utah at the State House there in Salt Lake City. Here's also a look at Ogden, Utah, on the upper right there. Heber City, Utah. Logan, Utah, on the lower right-hand corner there. We're almost there. Vermont. Here's a look at Burlington, Vermont. Look at the turnout in Burlington and Montpelier, the state capital. Pay teachers, not ICE. Virginia. But here's Virginia Beach and Arlington and Richmond and Roanoke, Virginia, and Glenn Youngkin hiding under a desk somewhere. Washington State saw really big crowds all over, including at Everett, Washington, where thousands of people turned out. And Governor Bob Ferguson turned out to address the crowd in Everett. There was really big turnout in Washington State in both Seattle and in Vancouver. That's Seattle on the left side of your screen there, Vancouver, Washington on the right side of your screen. Did West Virginia turn out for No Kings this weekend? Yes, they did. Among other places, they turned out in Charleston and in Kaiser and Berkeley Springs and Morgantown, West Virginia. Love your country enough to fight for it. Wisconsin, dozens of protests across Wisconsin, thousands and thousands of people in Cathedral Square Park in Milwaukee. That's a time lapse there in Madison, Wisconsin on the lower left. Also Catersburg, Wisconsin here, and Appleton, Wisconsin. Wyoming, a frigid, windy day in Wyoming, but people turned out at the state capitol in Cheyenne. Here's a look as well at Laramie and Jackson and Rocky Springs, Wyoming. And you've been waiting for this one. You've been waiting for this one. You think anybody turned out in Washington, D.C.? Huge crowds in D.C. He's not even 1 year into his first term in office, and this is what D.C. looks like lined up against him. He is not even 1 year into his first, not even fully into his first year in office here. And he just had one of the largest days of protest in American history against him in every freaking state in the country.